Okay, we're back. We're live. This is Jay Fidel. I'm here with Gauri Khandekar. She joins us from Brussels, and that's an important city these days. Gauri is with Global Relations Forum. Gauri lives only a couple of hundred meters from the metro station that was blown up on Tuesday. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion, Gauri.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So midnight in Brussels. I guess our title today is Violence in Brussels. And I think everybody knows what happened on Tuesday, but what they don't know is what happened today, Friday. Gauri, can you tell us what happened today in Brussels?
Yes, there have been police raids today in an area called Schaerbeek, and more precisely Place Mézère, which is just a kilometer from where I live. And there have been 3 explosions. It's yet unsure if bombs were blasted or they were detonated, but there was a detonation robot, and a man was uh, uh, de-armed, and he was actually shot in the leg. And they're pretty dramatic pictures on Twitter and all the news. But these 3 explosions and the disarming of the gentleman happened just right behind my home, basically. And again, the violence continues, sadly, in Brussels.
Yeah, when we first talked about the Paris bombings, you and I discussed the Molenbeek neighborhood, which you indicated is not too far from where you live.
Yes.
Molenbeek plays a role in all of this, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I mean, there's so many questions raised here as to why Belgium has become a terror hub in a way, because even if you see the amount of European fighters in Syria, the ones traveling from Europe to Syria, if you see the per capita ratio, Belgium appears on top. So, in comparison to this population, there are more fighters going from Belgium. And questions have been raised as to why is Belgium so weak in counterterrorism, why these attacks have been happening, and why have they been emanating from Molenbeek or these areas around Brussels. Actually, even in Belgium, there are different cities who are questioning why Brussels has been so weak on security and integration, if as the case may be. But there are a lot of issues that need to be addressed, including cooperation between various services, the police and the counterterrorism bureaus, in terms of how the mayors of different areas of Brussels get in touch with their populations, and how integration happens, basically.
Yeah. Well, there was an article in the New York Times, repeated in the Star Advertiser this morning around that very point, which we'll talk about in a minute. But first, let's do the basic story. So, what happened on Tuesday in Belgium?
Well, on Tuesday morning around 7:30, there was a blast at the airport, the main airport in Brussels, the international airport called Zaventem. And the blast happened at the departure lounge, which is an area where you could freely walk in. You don't need tickets. It goes, everybody can basically enter until you go to the security check. So it's quite an open airport. It's been so safe that hardly any security has ever been needed there. And these blasts happened when 3 terrorists walked in with suitcases full of explosives, and the explosives were also next to shrapnel, like nails and other material, bolts even, which made the attack even worse. So that was the first attack. So 2 of the terrorists, out of the 3, they died in the attacks because they also wore suicide vests. But a third managed to escape because his suitcase bomb didn't explode. So there were 2 explosions at the airport, but the third explosion didn't go off, thankfully, which would have made it much worse. And the third terrorist escaped. Then an hour later, around 8:50 or 9 a.m., There was an attack which happened at Malbek metro station, which is really around 250 meters from my home, and very close to the EU institutions, the European Union's key institutions, the Council, where all the European leaders meet, and there are meetings of all European ministries. So, right in front of these institutions, at that metro station, a carriage was blown, and the impact was so much that the entire carriage was mangled, anyways, but there were more casualties uh, that took place at the metro station. Around 20 people died and many, many more injured. But the impact was so bad that people were actually getting burns even outside the metro station. The
Oh,
metro is quite deep. So, so it was incredible.
yeah. So what happened? Okay, so what happened after that? I guess it was pandemonium in the press here, which was I guess on Tuesday or rather Monday night. It must have been. It was Monday night, Hawaii time. There was
Yes.
an indication that because the authorities were concerned that the terrorists were using cell phones to communicate, they turned off all the cell phone towers. So nobody could communicate. Did you know that?
Actually, I didn't know that. And I think now I understand much better, when I had doubted it, but all our telephones were shut, and, everybody, I think I spent the entire of Tuesday just reassuring people that I'm okay, and people all around the world have been contacting me, all my contacts, and, family and friends, and they've just been worried, and they couldn't reach me on via phone, but WhatsApp was working and email was working, and
Yeah.
Jay, I think we were in contact as
Yes,
well.
we
So
were. Yes.
it was a bit of chaos, and but I think people still managed to get in touch with relatives somehow.
So
But
what sort of reaction did people have in Brussels? I mean, the local people in Brussels and visiting Europeans, and I guess the officials in the EU. What kind of reaction came forward after this bombing?
well, the first kind of most important reaction is that everybody was shocked. I mean, the local people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody didn't have, people hardly had an idea that something like this would happen, because, I mean, generally everybody's, it's a working city. People are more interested in their work, and it was, rush hour time, and for the news to get to people already, it took, well, it came fast, but still, people's reaction was one of surprise. And, it's incredible that a city like Brussels would come under attack. It's so quiet. It's a small town. It's a working city, and it's been so accommodating. I mean, every culture fits in, and everybody's fit in. That's Brussels' identity. There's no identity of the city itself. It's a melange of different identities and cultures.
Yeah, and it's tolerant city, isn't it?
Very tolerant, extremely tolerant. And the second reaction, of course, I mean, because it's the capital of Europe, it was symbolically seen as an attack on Europe itself. And that's what most of the leaders have said,
Yeah.
that it's an attack on Europe. And it felt that way in a way, because I mean, European institutions are here, and every European nationality is represented here.
Yeah. Now, was
So
there a right-wing reaction? I mean, were people angry, wanted to, get even and take steps, close these possibilities down? I mean, what sort of reaction on the right-hand side?
not much, or not visible. I mean, people have just been reeling in from the shock. They've been more interested in really what's happening at the moment, and I don't think people have had the possibility to digest these events and then react in a more kind of angry fashion or upset fashion. It's just been a bit of shock. Like I said, another explosion took place this morning,
Yeah.
and so these events are just continuing, and I think today is the final day of the 3-day mourning period. after those attacks. So it's still early days, but I mean, the city has reacted still quite surprisingly well. There were people in the area around the stock exchange, which is called the Bourse,
Yeah.
which is in the center of Brussels, and there was a show of support to the to the people and to the city, and they were saying that we're united in this and we won't be defeated by the terrorists, and a lot of tributes were paid to the victims.
Yeah.
Uh,
And there was
and
solidarity with France too.
exactly, yes,
Mr. Holland came and stood next to what's his name, Michel,
yes,
and
Jean Michel.
yeah, and they expressed solidarity with the two countries. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, in this sense, France and Belgium have been quite closely linked on an unfortunate side because of these terrorist attacks. Um, and as far as I know, apparently today, the 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 raids that took place with the explosion and the man who was disarmed, um, he was involved in another Paris attack that was in the planning. So there are future attacks on Paris that were being planned that have been spoiled today by the police, actually.
Yeah.
So
Well,
it's like,
I wanted to mention this article in the Times. The headlines will be different, but the headline that was used in the Star Advertiser in repeating the article said, missteps made before bloodshed. Officials acknowledged they had been alerted to bombing suspects. So now there's a certain amount of recrimination happening, at least at some levels, and the Times reported that. And I guess you'll see more of that in Brussels as we go forward. But it appears that the authorities did have information about a nexus between the group that that did the Paris attacks and that were actually planning attacks in Brussels, which suggests a nexus of terrorism between the two cities. Has that been in the press in Belgium?
not much. I think what's been happening in what's been circulating in the Belgian press is more about Salah Abdeslam, who had been captured, and he had been captured last week, and it should have been expected that there would be attacks soon in Belgium itself, even because the terrorists then his colleagues would know that he would spill the beans on them, and he since Salah, when he was caught, he was shot in the leg. So he had been operated upon, and for 4 days, there was just 1 hour of questioning because he was apparently tired. So they let him off quite easily, saying that he was tired and he couldn't speak. And if they had questioned him more, then maybe he could have given more clues as to the attacks that happened now.
Yeah.
And it's just been a series of gaffes. Um, Apparently, the Belgians did know about it, the Belgian security services, but they didn't act upon it. And it's, you just question why didn't they, What
Yeah.
was the reason that they didn't? Even the Americans, actually, John Kerry was here today. And the Americans, sorry, um, and the Americans had this information uh, about all these terrorists,
Yeah.
all the terrorists that were in Brussels. And so one questions why the Belgians didn't engage in counterterrorism cooperation with the US when their allies had this information. But yeah, it's just been a series of gaps, and I can tell you later on how Salah himself was found,
Yeah.
and it was a huge mistake.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all this will be revisited, I'm sure, because people want to know, not only in Belgium, but in France, and not only that in Europe, but in the U.S. They'll want to know. One thing that came out in the immediate reporting, at least here, was that Belgium has a different arrangement than a lot of other countries in Europe. There's most countries have a single police force or a single, police presence under one organization. But Belgium has 6 police forces, and just by that number, it's hard to coordinate the efforts. I mean, has there been any talk about that? about trying to streamline their police force?
Not that I'm aware of, but yes, that would be an issue, of course.
Yeah.
Even the different areas in Brussels, they have different mayors. So,
Yeah.
and all of this complication is even complicated even further by language barriers and the political representativeness. So it's a complicated city.
Yeah.
It's quite divided.
And that makes
Uh,
it vulnerable.
Yes, of course. And it just reflects, the complex arrangements that are present in Europe and how detached they are from an actual secure environment despite their common borderless zone. So in the Schengen area, I think we've spoken about this in previous episodes as well. Um, European countries don't share uh, information and intelligence as a group, which they should via an organization called Europol, a European police organization that they've organized.
Yes.
But they share information and intelligence bilaterally,
Yes.
which means that all countries don't have access, despite terrorists having access, free access geographically within Europe in terms of their planning. And so communication gaps are huge. And in that, as you mentioned, there's six police services here in Brussels, but also the main piece of information that has come about is that the intelligence bureaus and the police in Brussels do not coordinate very easily.
Yeah.
So,
The Times article also talked about an emerging awareness of the fact that these terrorist cells emanated from Syria. In other words, people who had come into continental Europe from Syria included some terrorists. And so those waves of migrants, it's sort of a worst case analysis. Those waves of migrants included people, not only terrorists, but people who were sympathetic to terrorists, who sort of carried the message and maybe the strategies had come into Europe. And that's very troubling because it was a humanitarian acceptance of all these refugees from Syria. And now we find that among them, according to this article, there were terrorists. Worst case analysis. I surmise there's going to be a reaction to that for future Syrian refugees. And I wonder even now, and maybe does Europe know who is there? Does Europe have a record data about who has come from Syria? There are hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, who have come into Europe over the past year as migrants and refugees. Is there anybody keeping a record of who they are?
actually, the individual countries might be like the UK and France and Germany, perhaps. And as we've known, Turkey itself had warned the Belgians of the attackers, the perpetrators, when Turkey had deported them to Belgium, saying that they were on their way to Syria, and both the two terrorists who have died in the airport attack have been have long records with the Belgian police. But there is some kind of legislation called PNR legislation, which is the passenger name record legislation, which means that airlines have to submit data about people traveling to and from different locations. So even of Syria, from Syria, for example, they would have to submit it to the authorities, national authorities. But that piece of legislation has been a bit controversial here in Europe because some countries do have varying degrees of internet freedoms. Sweden, for example, doesn't even ban child pornography because they have a very high understanding of what internet freedom should be, for instance. So, finding consensus amongst 28 member states has been difficult. Although today the EU's counterterrorism coordinator said that this PNR legislation, the European Parliament agreed to legislate on it soon. So it should be back on the table by April at the latest.
Well, if you start connecting the dots around Europe, which inevitably people will do, You look at Turkey, and we had a report about Turkey a couple of days ago here on Think Tech, where there have been terrorist attacks in Ankara, and now more recently a series of terrorist attacks in the capital, or the largest city. Ankara is the capital. Istanbul is the largest city, and there was some serious terrorism there a few days ago. And between that and Brussels and Paris, you really wonder whether the UK will vote in favor of leaving the EU come the election in June. Any thoughts about that, given what has happened?
Well, I heard that Donald Trump recently said that the UK should leave, especially with the view to the Brussels attacks. But I honestly think that the UK would be more vulnerable if it did leave. Um, you never know how much that might impact cooperation, because the 28 member states counterterrorism units do meet every week at least here in Brussels, and this is within the European Union, you know. So there are different aspects like these which could play a role.
Yeah.
But I just think that it depends on how much uh, the UK population listens to whom, you know, because there are these anti-EU parties in the UK who are really campaigning quite actively. And if they manage to twist the message in a way that, you know, these Brussels attacks would happen in the UK if it continued to stay in the EU, then I mean it could sway the vote, but still it's a huge
Yeah, yeah.
debate on its own.
Well, it's not contained. It's not contained to continental Europe either. There was an incident a couple of days ago in the UK where they foiled a terror plot. They found a plot that was well developed and foiled it. So it's clear that the EU is also susceptible to this spread of terrorism, and you get the feeling, that it's a war. That there are many of these recruits and newly trained terrorists willing to kill themselves are like all over the place. And I guess one question I put to you is why, from their point of view. You suggested a minute ago that it was reprisal of some sort that they bombed Brussels, but maybe it was also a practical matter because they knew that the jig might be up on some of them because of the people who were caught and that fellow who was caught last week, right? He may have spilled the beans, and so ISIS only had a short time before their organization might be compromised, so they had to act before it was compromised by what he might tell the police. But I just wonder, why Brussels? Why all over Europe? Why is this spreading? What is in their minds strategically? What is the benefit that ISIS would have? Maybe it's just that they want to create terror, but what do you think their strategic plan is here?
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't know. You know, this is a question which I've been thinking about as well. Um, it just, I mean, there's no big political plan, or maybe there is because they've not yet attacked any of the religious symbols. Yes, because that would mean more of a religious war.
Yeah.
So if you've noticed, ISIS and these other terror groups have made a point not to attack or bomb, for now, any of the religious symbols, churches or, you know, cathedrals. So that's one point. But on the other broader view of things, when I've also been researching, I've researched a bit on counterterrorism as well. And the rallying cry has been Europeans have backed Israel, and Europeans have taken part in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and now latest in Syria. So that's been one of the main rallying cries. The second issue, and I doubt how much that is linked to what comes off as a very confused picture, is treatment of the Muslim population here. But again, you know, I mean, it doesn't make sense because I mean sometimes it's more the European side saying, oh, maybe our integration policies have not worked. Is that why, we have these homegrown terrorists? But I've not heard most of the terrorists themselves that have been caught. I've given reports saying that, I mean, they look at more the broader picture of about the West in so-called Islamic states. So it's still confusing yet.
Yeah, it is confusing, and yet it seems to be spreading. The Middle East is no better off, and now Saudi Arabia is actively attacking, what they consider terrorist forces in Yemen. There's a lot of violence there, a bombing and the like, Iraq is not resolved at all. Syria certainly, despite that recent truce with Russia, that's not resolved either, although there are talks going on. I mean, the violence, if you drew a map of all the violence, it would be more than ever before and spreading all the way to Europe. And we had I was mentioning before the show, here in Honolulu, we had the Board of Governors meeting of Pacific Forum, your old organization here in Honolulu, where you were back a couple of years ago, where I met you, had its annual function in Waikiki, and Richard Armitage, who is an official in the State Department, and who has seen it all over the years. He's very senior. Spoke about of course he could not help but speak about what's happening in Europe. And someone asked him, is this going to repeat? He said, yes. We're going to pattern here. This is going to happen again. And somebody asked him, is this going to happen in the U.S.? And he said, well, probably yes. He also said there's no guarantees it won't happen in Hawaii. So what we have is, sort of a brush fire here. It seems to be spreading with the wind. And the U.S. is not, exempt from that. So, you really wonder, are we in World War III right now? Is this the kind of thing that we can expect going forward? Is this the new normal?
It certainly feels like Europe is at war here. I mean, the preparedness, the attacks that are going on and off across European capitals, it does give you the impression that Europe is at war, and maybe it is a clash of civilizations, which everybody dreaded. But you do get that feeling. Of course, there are going to be threats of attacks. I think it's as one counterterrorism security expert said quite famously. I think it's become a famous dialogue now. That the terrorists have to be lucky just once, but we have to be lucky every day.
Right, that's
Which
true.
is, yeah, it's so true. And there are going to be people with nothing better to do than plan attacks because they're brainwashed, and they have nothing really better to do.
Yeah,
And they think that's their life purpose. So it's more a psychological battle as well that you have to engage in.
yeah.
But you're right. I think there's this feeling of being at war, and I really don't know at what point Europe got more dangerous than India. Because today, my family was like, "Why don't you come to India? It's safer here." And I still get the feeling.
Just when you thought it was safe to go outside.
I mean, Europe has been, the Kantian paradise. It's almost like Hawaii. It's safe and it's peaceful. It used to be now.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, we all grew up with that. Europe was nirvana.
Yeah.
Europe was a beautiful country, and the people
Yeah.
were so interesting and beautiful and creative and all that, and great things to see and enjoy the history. And now you really have to look over your shoulder in Europe. What a tragedy that is.
Exactly. I mean, when did it all change? And it did happen recently, actually.
Yeah,
More than like 2 years ago, you could see none of these security personnel on the ground, and you hardly even saw the police,
yeah.
except for France. Of course, they had the gendarmerie everywhere you went. But other than that, no, it was so safe.
Well, one interesting metric is these websites selling travel packages. We all get email from them, and they want to, sell you a package of airfare and hotel and tour tour moves, tour packages, one kind or another. And I've noticed that over the past few days, since the bombings in Brussels, there's a lot of real bargains on these websites, and I suspect that they suspect this is going to slow down world travel, or at least travel to Europe. I mean, if you sat here from the U.S. looking east to Europe, you would say, I think I'll postpone my trip to Europe right now. It doesn't sound like a really great idea to go there right now.
The Americans did give a travel warning to all American citizens: don't travel to Europe unless
Really?
absolutely necessary. Yeah, it was an official warning, and when I saw that, I was so shocked because this is this kind of warning you get when you go to, like, conflict zones, and this has become a conflict zone, sadly.
Well,
So
among other things, this seems to show that ISIS is very sophisticated. I mean, when we looked at the dispute between Apple and the FBI a couple of weeks ago, the issue was, can we afford to allow people in general to, bypass encryption, or rather to have encryption, because terrorists use cell phones as a way of doing command and control. And that came out. That came out in Brussels. That's exactly what they were doing. And what I saw, one report was that they had these throwaway cell phones. You
yes,
buy them cheap, and they were using those for command control. And then they were taking cell phones from the wounded and the dying and the dead and using them to communicate. So cell phones are a big part of command and control for these terrorist operations. They're very sophisticated in the way they operate, all for the price of a cheap throwaway cell phone,
right,
or maybe one that's stolen. But they have ways to communicate, and therefore
right.
they're all the more dangerous.
Right. I agree with that. Technology is playing such a huge role. Not only that, but nowadays you have really highly sophisticated encrypted apps that you could communicate over, and nobody could crack into your communicating app, for instance. The police really need to up their game here. I mean, just two incidents I would like to tell you about is that the first time when they found Abdeslam, Salah Abdeslam, the police had actually gone into a house, which they thought was empty, and they broke in. And apparently, there were these two terrorists who came in, who attacked them. And the police had gone even without their vests, their bulletproof vests. So that was the level of unpreparedness and misinformation that they had, and they found Salah there. Um, it also shows how much actually the community has been saving him. A lot of safe houses that he had, and people who sympathized with him, and they kept him safe for 4 months since the Paris attacks here. The other issue was when the terrorists that carried out the Brussels attack, the airport attacks. Um, Actually, a taxi driver contacted the police. He had said that he was called by these terrorists, and and he found it quite suspicious that they wouldn't let him touch their bags. They wouldn't let him put it in the hold, and they had requested for a big taxi because they had a lot of luggage, and still another suitcase could not be fitted in,
Uh-huh.
into the hold. So those people left the suitcase at their home. And when the taxi driver saw the pictures of these terrorists, which were circulated on the web, he contacted the police himself. And he said, I just dropped these people off at the airport. And, he took them to the place where he had picked them up from, thankfully. And the police found a fifth suitcase with explosives in it. And this again shows the level of unpreparedness. The police really need to up their game, whether it's technology, but also basic intelligence.
Yeah. And on the side of that, terrorists, terrorists, the ones in Paris and the ones in Brussels, are very sophisticated. I mean, the bomb maker, his name is in the New York Times article. I'll try to pronounce it. Lacraoui. Can you pronounce it?
Lacraoui.
Lacraoui. Lacraoui is still at large, according to the article. Lacroix is the guy who made the bombs in both Paris and Brussels.
Yes.
And what I heard on Hawaii, or rather on National Public Radio, which was very chilling, was that these bombs had one thing in common. The technology was the same in both cases, aside from the shrapnel, which I think is really cruel and nasty to the nth degree, murderously nasty. The bombs were made out of household chemicals. In other words, nail polish remover, which you can get, I think, pretty much anywhere in a pharmacy, and acetone, which you could get in any hardware store.
Yeah.
And so, they have found a way to make bombs using locally available materials. They don't have to smuggle them in. They don't have to cross borders with them. And nothing fancy. They can just, buy it at the hardware store down the block. And so this is really scary because it means they could generate lethal devices almost anywhere in the world.
Right. Right. It is scary, I mean, you have this level of ingenuity which probably has been seen in Afghanistan, when they made these roadside IEDs, and in Iraq as well. I mean, European Union has been quite advanced in the sense that they've put in place legislation which stopped the sale of uh, substances which could be used to make um, these these bombs, these kind of bombs. But those are more the chemicals. But when you tell me that it's things as easily found as nail polish remover, which you can get in any supermarket, even it's surprising. And how are we going to combat that? Are we going to stop nail polish removers sold anywhere? I mean, that's going to be impossible.
Nobody will be able to do nail polish remover on their nails.
But I mean, it's really, it's gonna be more about intelligence, hard intelligence, about really finding the people. Everybody was talking here about how the Brussels airport is so open, and you could just walk in. Your bags don't need to be checked in the departure lounge, until the security checks. And then there were others who were saying, well, if you make the line outside the departure lounge, then that area is going to become unsecure. And
Sure.
how far are you going to push the line, basically?
Yeah.
And these are issues which are quite pertinent.
Yeah.
And you cannot prevent these kind of mass kind at the mass level, but rather you're going to need to look at the intelligence, the hardcore intelligence,
Yeah.
and find the person actually.
Yeah, it reminds me again of the Apple versus FBI, because the FBI was not able to achieve the cooperation of Apple, even after a court order required Apple to cooperate. And so the FBI started looking elsewhere, and apparently has found computer experts, either in this country or elsewhere. There was one report in Reuters to the effect that there was an Israeli company helping the FBI, to crack that phone that was picked up in San Bernardino. So I think what you have is the government now realizes that it must achieve its own ingenuity, it must achieve its own technology, and it must meet the terrorists, at the pass with its own creative solutions.
Right.
And I think that'll have to happen in Europe just as well. And there will be changes around you, Gauri. I'm sure you'll see that. There'll probably be more bombings, but there'll also be changes. And Europe will have to come together over this. You'll probably see it in Brussels, right down the block from your house.
Yeah, it's a sad reality, actually. Things. I mean, at least Europe is becoming more different, very different. It used to be this area that, very free and open, but now it's really changing. It's a sad reality. Actually, in the news, you could see that the Israeli government was also being consulted in terms of their airport. I forget the name. Would you know the name of the airport?
What, in Israel?
Yes.
Lod, Lod.
The main airport,
Yeah.
which which is quite secure apparently, and they've been consulting them as well on how to make the airport more secure.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Things are about to change here, and
Yeah.
I don't think the same uh, way of life can continue really.
Yeah. Well, how do you feel personally? I mean, I'm sure you've had thoughts about your own security walking down the street, and you travel. When you take an airplane, how do you feel about it? Are you building this into your system, or do you have concern about it?
I have not left the house since.
Got it.
I have not left the house. We're supposed to be in lockdown, and I completely respect it. Honestly, I've just gone out to walk my dog. I flew back from India the day before these attacks happened. And I would have been at the airport at the same time. I arrived at the same time as the attacks, just the difference of a day, thankfully. And the Malbec metro attacks, again, as I mentioned, they're just 250 meters from my house. And I have not left my home since. I am really afraid of these attacks, which any rational person would be. I don't want to go out and tempt fate. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just happy to stay
Oh my
inside as
goodness. I'm so
hard as
sorry to hear
possible.
that. Well, we want, as I told you earlier this week, we want you to be well and safe, Gauri. We send our concern to you, and we want to come back to you and talk to you some more about it. I hope you get a chance to do lots of walks with your dogs in the meantime, with your dog in the meantime.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
That's Gauri Khandekar, under siege in Brussels, having experienced at close hand the explosions and terror attacks there, talking with us about violence in Brussels here on Midnight in Brussels. Gauri is she is the founder of Global Relations Forum, and this is and also for Europe in general. Thank you so much, Gauri.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks a lot.
Aloha.